In the year 1189, the man they called the Lionheart became King of England. His name was Richard Plantagenet, and he had spent his whole life fighting in France. He was 31 years old, 6 feet tall, with rust-red hair and a temper to match. He could outfight any 2 knights in his kingdom, and he knew it. His throne was barely warm before a crisis dragged him east. 3 years earlier, in 1187, the Muslim general Saladin had taken Jerusalem. He slaughtered or enslaved the Christian defenders and claimed the holy city for Islam. Christendom was stunned, and Pope Gregory VIII answered with a new crusade, the Third. Kings and counts across Europe took the cross and swore to march east. None did it like Richard. He sold offices, raised taxes, and joked he would have sold London itself for 1 more man at arms. By the summer of 1190, his fleet was ready. He appointed ministers to run England and sailed away, but not set foot on English soil for years. Out of his 10-year reign, Richard spent less than 6 months in England. He spoke French, ate French food, sang French songs, and fought French wars. England to him was just a title and a pile of taxes, barely a country he knew. His fleet stopped first in Sicily, where he quarreled with King Philip of France like 2 boys spoiling for a fight. From Sicily, a great storm drove Richard's ships off course. They limped to the island of Cyprus, ruled by a self-styled emperor named Isaac Comnenus. Isaac robbed Richard's shipwrecked men without a shred of shame. Richard did not forgive. He took Cyprus by storm in a matter of weeks. From Cyprus, the fleet at last sailed on to the Holy Land. Saladin's garrison was starving inside the walls. The camp outside was a sprawl of tents, banners, and slow-rotting disease. When Richard arrived, the other leaders were relieved and worried in equal measure. Relieved because the Lionheart brought men, money, and the prestige of a king, and worried because Richard was famously impossible to command. He personally led assaults on the walls, sword in hand, banner streaming. After weeks of bitter combat, the city surrendered. But Saladin had promised a ransom for the Muslim garrison, and he stalled. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Richard's patience broke. He ordered the garrison marched out and executed about 2,700 men in one afternoon under the summer sun. It was an act of cold-blooded cruelty, even by the standards of the age, and the first glimpse of the cold iron that ran through Richard's heart. The Crusader army moved south along the coast toward Jerusalem. Saladin's cavalry shadowed them from the hills. His horse archers struck the column every day, probing for weakness. Richard held his army in a tight square, with crossbowmen on the flanks, and crawled south. On September 7th, 1191, the Muslim army finally closed in for battle. Saladin sent wave after wave of horse archers, circling, loosing arrows, trying to break the formation. Richard's discipline held. Then Saladin committed his heavy cavalry for the killing blow, and that was his mistake. At Richard's signal, the Christian knights lowered their lances and charged. The Christian line hit the Muslim horse like a hammer on an anvil. Saladin's army broke and ran. It was the greatest cavalry charge of the medieval age, and the road to Jerusalem lay open. But Richard did not march on it immediately. His army was tired, sick, and low on supplies. By early 1193, the Crusaders were camped just 12 miles from Jerusalem. Richard rode forward with a small escort and climbed the Mount of Olivet. From the ridge, he looked down at the holy city, the walls, the golden dome. So close, so impossibly close, but he could not take it. His army was too small, too sick, and Saladin's forces outnumbered him 2 to 1. Siege would fail. An assault would be a massacre. Richard turned his horse and rode back to camp. Chroniclers say he covered his face with his shield as he rode away. He never came that close to Jerusalem again. He retreated to the coast and tried to negotiate. He proposed treaties. He proposed joint rule, anything that would give him the city. Saladin listened, considered, and refused. Meanwhile, Philip of France had gone home, and he was already seizing Richard's lands in Normandy and Anjou. Richard was being stabbed in the back by his own allies. He had to leave the Holy Land. He made one last stand at Jaffa when Saladin's army attacked the city in a dawn assault. The Christian garrison was driven back into the sea. Richard gathered what knights he could and charged on foot into the enemy with a battle axe in his hands. The Muslims fell back, surprised by the fury of the man. It was Richard's last great fight in the East. He sailed for home in October 1192. The journey was a disaster. A great storm wrecked his ship on the Adriatic coast. Richard and a few loyal men wandered through Central Europe in disguise, trying to slip home. They were recognized near Vienna by Duke Leopold of Austria's men. Leopold arrested him on the spot. Richard had insulted Leopold at the siege of Acre. He had torn the Duke's banner down from the walls in front of everyone. Leopold had a long memory and a deep grudge. He threw Richard into a castle dungeon at Dürnstein. The news electrified Europe. Henry VI, the Holy Roman Emperor, demanded the prisoner be handed over. Leopold could not refuse his overlord. Richard was transferred to a stricter German prison. The emperor demanded a ransom of 100,000 silver marks. It was twice the annual income of the English crown, the largest ransom ever demanded in medieval Europe. England had to find the money. Churches were taxed, villages were taxed, gold chalices were melted down. Even the great golden chalice of Canterbury was fed into the furnace. The money was gathered, packed onto wagons, and carried into Germany. Richard was at last released in February 1194. He returned to England a free man, and was crowned king a second time, just in case the first coronation had been invalid. He barely stayed long enough to take a bath. Within months, he was back in France, fighting Philip for his lost lands. The war dragged on for years across Normandy and Anjou, castle by castle. Richard was at his best in this kind of grinding, castle-by-castle war. On a chilly March evening in 1199, he was besieging a minor castle in Limousin, the Château de Châlus-Chabrol, barely worth a king's time. A small chest of treasure had been found in the grounds, and Richard wanted it. The garrison refused to surrender. On the evening of March 25th, Richard rode too close to the walls to inspect them. A young defender, alone on the battlements, took careful aim with a crossbow. The boy was named Bertrand de Gordon. The bolt flew straight. It struck Richard in the left shoulder, just below the neck. Richard was carried to his tent, the bolt still lodged in his body. The surgeons tried to remove the bolt, but the wound festered. Gangrene set in. Richard knew he was dying. He summoned the young crossbowman, who had been captured, and asked him why he had done it. The boy said Richard had killed his father and his brothers in the wars, and he had done it to defend his home. Richard, in a strange last grace, pardoned the boy who had killed him. On April 6th, 1199, Richard the Lionheart died. He was 41 years old, the greatest crusader of his age, killed by a single bolt from a frightened boy at a castle that wasn't worth mentioning. His body was buried at Fontevraud Abbey at his father's feet. His heart was buried separately in Rouen. England, the country he barely knew, went on without him. He spent less than 6 months of his reign in England. He had nearly taken Jerusalem. He had been the most famous warrior in Christendom. He had been the prisoner of an emperor. In the end, the Lionheart fell to a child's aim on a cold French evening. That is the life of Richard Coeur de Lion.